UNLV Microcertificate Economics. Okay, government spending and revenue. So we have these two competing theories of government. One says minimal government, police, courts. The other says we need to get out there and talk about market failure and things like externalities. Okay, maybe the income distribution, maybe a bunch of other things are important enough for us to talk about. Okay? So, United States, federal system. A federal system means we have different levels of government that are, at least in some ways, independent of each other. So in the United States, you live in the U.S., but you live in a state, then you live in a county, then maybe you live in a city. Sometimes it's hard to tell. If you're sitting on campus at UNLV, you're not in Las Vegas, you're in Paradise, because Clark County is made up of a small number of cities: Las Vegas, Henderson, North Las Vegas, Mesquite, and Boulder City are the 5 cities. Everything else is a town, which has less authority than a city. Then there are school districts and all kinds of other things. So we have all these various sort of independent levels of government. Most countries actually have what's called a unitary system, and that means there's a central government, and even the cities, what the cities do, fall under the purview of the central government. And if you think about the fact that most countries are much smaller than the United States, that probably makes sense for them. This is the size of government in the United States going back to the late 90s. You notice that it's in the late 90s, it's 35-36%. For a long time, it was 32-33%. So the government of the United States was spending equivalent to a third of the gross domestic product of the United States. And if we don't know what GDP is, we'll get there. It's just think of it for now as the total expenditure in the economy. So the government was doing about a third. And that's federal, state, local, all the different levels of government. That's sort of in the middle of governments in the world, by the way. A lot of governments are well over that, some of them over 50%, and some governments are much smaller. So we went along, and then we have a recession. 2008, 2009, 2010, we're coming out of the recession. During that recession, the government spends a lot of money, and it goes up to being 43% of the economy. Then it starts to come back down. It goes back down into that normal range, and then the pandemic hits, and back up it goes. Okay? So we expect now, pandemic over, that percentage will come back down, but we'll keep an eye on it and see what happens. What do we spend money on? So this is 2020. This is during the pandemic, which, kind of affects things in funny ways, but that's okay. Federal spending is divided into 2 broad categories. One of those is what's called mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is required. It's entitlements. So it's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's things that Congress passed a law and therefore you are entitled to. Unless Congress changes the law, you get that money. During the pandemic, we had that Paycheck Protection Program, which is in there, which didn't go to a lot of paychecks, mostly went to large businesses. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. We have unemployment compensation in there and so on. That in 2020 by itself was 21.8% of GDP. It was $4.6 trillion. Okay? Everybody with me on that? Mandatory. So the president don't have much control over that. There's also interest, and we issued a bunch of bonds, and we have to pay interest on the national debt. That was $345 billion, 1.6% of GDP. Then discretionary spending is the spending that Congress approves in the budget every year. That spending was 7.8% of GDP, 1.6 trillion. The biggest piece of that normally is defense, but there was a whole bunch of other stuff that went on because of the pandemic, right? And so that swolled up the other parts of this. But people, when they talk about federal spending, they should note that the piece of it, which is non-defense governmental agencies, is a couple of $100 billion. And you go, oh, that's a lot of money. But when the government's spending $6.6 trillion, the couple $100 billion, you could wipe that all out and it wouldn't make a dent in how much we spend. So 2019, right before the pandemic, the discretionary was 1.3, the mandatory was 2.7. So you can see what the pandemic did to government spending. It added $2.6 trillion to it. Of that, 1.9 trillion was mandatory spending, and 0.3 trillion was discretionary. You can also look up there and see revenues, and notice that revenues were only 3.4 trillion, so the government had to borrow $3.2 trillion to pay for its spending in 2020. Okay, and we'll talk about that more as time goes on. You can see on that graph that the largest piece of revenue is individual income taxes. That's personal income taxes. The second largest piece is payroll taxes. That's your Social Security taxes primarily. And then all the rest of the taxes are really small. Corporate taxes used to be as big as individual taxes, but we've given the corporations lots and lots and lots of tax cuts. And now companies like Amazon don't pay taxes to the federal government. And then, of course, others, things like tariffs and transfers and fees. And it's, you go to a national park, you pay a fee. That's in other. So again, we look at this, the income tax, 1.6 trillion, the payroll tax, 1.3, corporate tax, only 0.2. And again, it wasn't that long ago that those two things were much more equal. Other 0.3, and you notice that, again, $3.4 trillion. 3.4 trillion. Sounds like a lot of revenue, but not when you're spending 6.6. So here's a website that you should know. It's called FRED. That's Federal Reserve Economic Database. And we'll give you a link to that if you haven't seen it in your deal. This is how much money the government took in versus how much it spent. This is the difference, the deficit or surplus, going back, into the 80s. You can see that there's deficits. Then actually there's 5 years where there's a surplus. And then we go back to deficits, and then all of a sudden, right, we have pretty big deficits during the recession, the 2008-2009 recession. We start to get those to go away, and the deficit start to go away, and then we have these big tax cuts, and because of the tax cut, the deficit gets bigger and bigger, and then the pandemic hits, and the deficit gets huge. The last U.S. president who didn't have a deficit was Bill Clinton. That's those years back in the little peaky area, back up in here. That's Bill Clinton. And then the last president who was president when the United States didn't owe anybody any money and had no debts was Andrew Jackson, and that was 1836. So the United States always has debt, always owes people money. So here's the national debt. Now, the correct way to measure the national debt is to compare it to GDP, right? Just like when you go out to buy a house, they're going to decide how much house you can afford by what your income is, and they'll compare your debt level to your income. We should do the same thing for the country. So we compare the national debt to our income, which is this gross domestic product, GDP. And you can see that generally speaking, it's recessions and wars that cause us to accumulate the big debts. So the War of 1812 is a big deficit problem. The Civil War, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II is huge, and we're climbing back up again. So the national debt now compared to GDP is about where it was in World War II, which is above 100% of GDP. And economists are debating whether that's really a problem or not, and we'll talk about that more later. So besides federal spending, we also spend at state and local governments. There are, again, state, cities, counties, school districts, special districts. There are states that have cemetery districts. There are 90,000 different governments scattered across the 50 states of the United States. 90,000. There are 3,000 counties, only 17 in Nevada. There are 19,519 cities, only 17 in Nevada, and 5 of them are in Clark County. There are whole counties in Nevada that don't have an actual city in them. And then 78,000 other districts, like 30,000 school districts and all this kind of stuff. Okay? Nevada has the second fewest number of governmental units per capita, and Nevada has one of the lowest amounts of public employees, lowest, we're pretty efficient for our state. So what do state and locals spend their money on? Well, the number one expenditure is what we call public welfare, and so that's welfare programs, health programs, housing programs. Second biggest thing is elementary and secondary education. Third is health and hospitals, and some health and hospitals expenditure is actually lumped into public welfare because that's Medicaid. Other health and hospitals, then higher education, highways and roads, police, jails, housing and community development, and the courts. Those are the basic expenditures of state and local government. Where do state and local governments get their money? Good question you asked. So here's state revenue. Again, we have a federal system, and that means that the taxes used on each level are different. So if we pop back here, income tax biggest, payroll tax second biggest. Before the Civil War, the U.S. government ran on tariffs. It's all it had was tariffs. So for almost 100 years, the federal government, 7, the federal government runs on tariffs. It has to put in more taxes during the Civil War to pay for the Civil War. The income tax is actually not constitutional in the original Constitution. It's not till 1916 that we amend the Constitution to allow for income taxes, and then they were for, if you didn't make at least $500,000 a year, you weren't paying any income tax. They were for rich folks. Okay? So where do the states get their money? Again, we're going to divide this up. States, their biggest, and you cut it off there, but the biggest source of revenue is transfers. So the state's biggest source of revenue is the federal government. Yeah. And in Nevada, our biggest source of revenue for the state is actually the federal government. Okay? And we might talk about some of those things. So second biggest is income taxes. Most states have income taxes. Obviously, Nevada is one of the ones that does not. Second is the sales tax. So states generally run, ignoring those transfers, states generally run on income taxes, sales taxes, and then charges. Do you pay a fee to get your car registered? Do you pay a fee to get your driver's license? Right? If you operate a business in the state of Nevada, you have to pay a fee to the state. So all of these fees that get paid to the state, user charges, you go use, some parks in the state you have to pay. That's the number 3 source of state revenue overall. Nevada, that would be number 2. Nevada, most states don't collect the property tax. Nevada does, in fact. The state collects part of the property tax. It collects all the tax, but it gets part of the property tax. Okay? And then selective sales tax, for example, there might be a special tax on tires or a tax on gasoline, right? States have state gasoline taxes. There's a federal gasoline tax and there's a state gasoline tax. That money, by the way, and I didn't put this in here, but you should know this word, earmarked. Some of what governments collect are earmarked. So money you pay to DMV goes to fund DMV. Gasoline taxes go into a fund to help with roads and to build roads. The sales tax, some of the sales tax here in Southern Nevada, by definition, goes to the police. Some of it goes to flood control. Okay, we have a new tax. We have, as a state, taxes on tourists that other states don't have. So if we look at Nevada, Nevada's biggest source of revenue are gaming taxes and taxes on tourists. So live entertainment tax, gaming tax, room tax. Because of that, Nevada has the lowest tax burden. People who live in Nevada pay the least taxes. The state has a lot more money than what it would have if it only got taxes from us normal people. Okay? Tourists pay half the taxes in this state. It means that citizens of this state pay very little in taxes relative to other states. Okay? Local revenue. So what do local governments get? Well, the biggest source of funding for local revenue, surprisingly, is transfers. Some of it comes directly from the Fed. Some of it comes from the state. So ignoring that, the biggest source of revenue at the local level, the cities and county level, are the property taxes. The next time you get a property tax bill, if you own a house, the next time you get your property tax bill, you can see that it's divided up. There's a school tax in there, the distributive school fund. There's money for the county or the city. It's all divided up, and you can tell where your property taxes are going. And where they're going depends on where you live. So there are cities that have corporate income taxes. There are cities that have individual income taxes. New York has income taxes and all kinds of. Cities generally don't have sales taxes, but some of them do. A few of them do. Cities, again, are primarily run off of sales tax and then off of charges. So you go use the swimming pool, you pay a couple bucks to get in and use the swimming pool or something like that, right? The city charges you things, or the county charges you, right? You need a business license to operate in Henderson. That's a charge. But think of government as the federal government is the biggest collector of income tax, states are the biggest collector of sales taxes, and cities and counties are the biggest collectors of property tax. It's a federal system. So again, the functions and revenues are divided up by level, logic, and tradition. The federal government gives money to the states for K-12, but it doesn't spend any. It gives money to the states for higher ed, but it doesn't actually do. Well, it does the military academies, but other than that, it doesn't actually do higher education. So we've divided up what each level of government does, and we've divided up, for the most part, where they get their money.